So first of all, let me say thank you all very much for inviting me here today, and it's great to be here. In the world of human rights, I see increased participation of women in defending and promoting rights which result in better outcomes for society across the board. In 2023, I presented a report to the General Assembly on women, peace and security. And it was Women Human Rights Defenders, Peace and Security. And I showed how extensive research proved that links greater participation of women human rights defenders and women with peace processes with a greater chance of success. And there's very definite benchmarks that prove that. And as we all know, peace needs all the help it can get now, as we're living in an age of armed conflict more than at any time since the Second World War. Yet resources are being directed away from investment in human rights and in peace, and are being diverted into weapons, defense, and security. The Trump administration has led the way in this with the massive cuts in US aid funding, which will impact most negatively, as it always does, on women, on LGBTI people, and on minorities. His rhetoric has demeaned the values contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, while his administration rolls back rights at home. But it's not just the US that's turning its back on human rights and human rights defenders. States which, for the past quarter of a century, have espoused the belief that human rights defenders can contribute to the creation of a more equal and just society and peaceful society, are also introducing major funding cuts, including the UK, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Sweden, and Switzerland, while at the same time cracking down on freedom of association, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly. This is being accompanied by the demonstration of the double standards on human rights that we've seen so blatantly in relation to Gaza, that it is threatening the whole future of the entire human rights system. One small example, the UK is the co-founder of the Media Freedom Coalition, a partnership of countries that advocate for global media freedom. Yet in Gaza, we have seen the greatest assault on media freedom, with journalists being specifically targeted and murdered by the dozen, over a couple of hundred of them. Having established media freedom as one of its foreign policy priorities, the lack of concrete support the UK is providing, the lack of noise it is making, can only reinforce the perceptions of so many human rights defenders I speak to from the global south, who routinely say and see the global north's posturing on human rights as nothing short of hypocrisy. And it is true that northern states are drowning under the weight of their own hypocrisy. Taking the rhetoric, the lack of political will, the funding cuts, and the inconsistent application of values into account, it is hard to read anything other than a huge deprioritization in traditionally supportive countries of human rights, and a concurrent weakening or loss of belief in the promise of human rights. And what a time to deprioritize human rights. In addition to Gaza, human rights defenders in Yemen, in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Myanmar, in Ukraine, in Haiti, in the DRC still, and many other places are being attacked and killed because they are documenting human rights violations or delivering humanitarian assistance to the civilian population, or providing gender-based violence services to traumatized women and girls, among other services. Restrictive legislation continues to bounce from country to country to turn people against human rights defenders. Draft NGO laws are becoming commonplace. In the last year alone, they were introduced in Rwanda, in Zambia, in Paraguay, in Venezuela, and in Tunisia. Though differing in detail, these laws generally impose excessive reporting requirements, extensive government oversight, burdensome registration requirements, and opaque criteria for denial of registration or suspension of activities. Some drafts contain a laundry list of acts that NGOs are not permitted to engage in, though rarely are those acts concretely defined. One such example is contained in the draft law governing non-governmental organisations in Rwanda. Article 7 of that law asserts that registration of NGOs may be refused if there is evidence indicating that the applicant organisation is harming or intends to harm the security, peace, health, unity of Rwandans, public order, good morals, or the rights and freedoms of others, whatever that means. And this is the kind of opaque language that we're seeing in all these NGO laws that are being brought in around the world. And then, of course, we have the Foreign Agents Law, which say that people, human rights defenders, despite it being in the declaration, the UN adopted declaration, that they can't receive foreign funding. And Georgia and Serbia are the latest countries to bring in those laws. And this type of legislation is a perversion of the ideals contained in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, implying it, as it does, that human rights are an ideological construct rather than an entitlement of birth. We have also seen increasingly serious charges being filed in democracies against those involved in non-violent protest, including here in the UK. Last year, I sent a formal letter to the government regarding the prosecution of a Just Stop Oil protester for engaging in a slow march. He got 6 months. And although he was charged under the 2023 amendment of the Public Order Act, which, although implemented under the previous government, remains on the books in the current government. The report I will be presenting to the General Assembly next month is on human rights defenders and a just transition relating to climate change. And it will highlight a growing trend of activists involved in non-violent environmental protests being hit with such charges, such as 5 young climate activists I met in Germany who have been charged with conspiracy to form a criminal organisation. They've had their homes raided, they've had their phones surveilled, and all they were doing was trying to draw attention to the climate crisis that we are in. There was a particularly ludicrous example in the US last September, where 2 climate activists, now they were much older, they were kind of in their 60s, were arrested at a demonstration outside Citibank's headquarters. One of them was playing the cello, he was playing Bach, and the other held an umbrella over his head to stop him, getting sunburned. And they were arrested and charged with criminal contempt, which carries a sentence of up to 7 years. All the while, the same old tools of repression are being used against defenders by autocratic governments, non-state actors, criminal organisations, and business interests. That hasn't gone away. That still happens. Defenders are still being criminalised unfairly. They're still being tortured. They're still being killed. They're still being disappeared. At least over 400 every year are killed for their peaceful work in defence of human rights in accordance with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when it comes to environmental and Indigenous rights people's defenders, they're murdered in their hundreds on an annual basis. I was up in the Amazon last year and I saw it myself. I visited so many Indigenous communities and also so many sites of massacres. And it's all to do with, big business interests, transnational mining, and the taking, the bauxite, the gold, illegal logging, everything like that away from the Indigenous community. And it's all being done with complete impunity. And I met children, young adults, who were taking over the struggle of their ancestors. Everything is to do with their parents and their grandparents and their ancestors who had been murdered. Those I met have for years been stewards of the forests and the rivers and the land that we live in, and have deep personal connections, both spiritual and cultural, to the land, and a respect for the natural environment that we need, all of us need at this time. An Indigenous woman, human rights defender from Argentina, who I recently met, told me if she spends prolonged periods away from her land, she gets physically ill. A sickness takes hold of her body. And yet, sadly, she is forced to spend periods away from her home because of the risks that she faces from actors who are trying to force her and her community off the land in order to exploit it for commercial gain. We are seeing renewed attacks on women, on the rights of women, on LGBTI persons, on minorities. While at the international level, the language that is used to articulate human rights is being majorly challenged by Russia, by China, and now the US, and emboldening all those other states, autocratic or veering towards autocratic, that are looking for excuses to behave badly. All of this leads me to believe that whilst human rights principles for human rights defenders and the values that drive them remain unchanging, for states they continue to form part of an a la carte menu to be endorsed when politically convenient or expedient. When confronted with these types of questions, I return to what human rights defenders have achieved since the 1998 UN Declaration on Human Rights, and continually fight and continually find a sense of renewal. They breathe life. Human rights defenders breathe life into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it reminds me why this fight is worth fighting. My report to the Council in 2023 was full of success stories of human rights defenders. For example, children who were stopping in Bangladesh, who were stopping forced child marriage with the commissioner. Mothers in Yemen who were working together with both sides to find out where their loved ones had been abducted and reuniting them if they were alive, but at least letting them find their bodies. And in my own country, Ireland, it was human rights defenders and civil society who were the driving force between reproductive rights and equal marriage. And finally, it's this tenacity and this persistence that gives hope to the world, in my view. And there are more people working now for human rights than there ever were before. I know human rights defenders will continue the work that they are doing at local level to build civil and just societies, even in the most difficult of contexts, such as Russia, such as China, such as Saudi Arabia. And last week I had a hearing with 10 human rights defenders in Gaza who are documenting human rights violations day by day in order to ensure that eventually there will be justice for the people of Gaza and the case. But they will be more effective, and with the principled and consistent support of states and with the support of initiatives like WG10, which can help elevate the standing of human rights in political discussion. And I leave you with my own version of a famous quote by the second UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. He said, the UN was not created to deliver us to heaven, but to save us from hell. And I think this is also applicable to human rights. They were not created to deliver us to heaven, but to save us from hell. Thank you.